Hello everybody, this is chapter 11. You can follow along on page 284 in your textbook. It's titled Feeding the World, and it is true that here in America we spend an awful lot of resources, land, to grow crops, and we do a very good job of it. We're going to learn in this chapter some of the techniques that are used that really make it possible for us to get exceedingly great yields from our acreage. And then we're also going to discuss why that might not be the best thing environmentally, and things that we can do to be more environmental about the way we grow our crops. Also in this chapter, remember, we have to think about how other countries grow their crops as well. And even though we have a decided advantage when it comes to mechanization, the fact is that other countries have to do things more the old-fashioned way. And most countries do spend a tremendous amount of effort and resources to grow crops for their people. I'm looking at the yellow box at the beginning of the chapter for the key ideas, the major objectives of this chapter, and in this video we'll cover the first one. It says, describe human nutritional needs and the challenges of overcoming hunger and malnutrition. Now, each one of these terms has a very specific definition that we'll get into during this video. Take a look at the statistics here about undernutrition. The definition of undernutrition is not consuming enough calories to be healthy. So you're just not getting enough glucose, and as a result of that, you don't have the energy that you need to operate. This graphic here shows you the numbers of people that are undernourished worldwide, and you can see how the numbers have increased over time. Here it is in 1969, and then things got a little better. In fact, we saw a decline happening here, and then we had a nice drop around 1995, and then a decided increase over the last 15 years or so. Why do we have that increase? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but probably the biggest reason is the fact that so many of these countries have been in a population increase. You know, we've talked about it in the other chapter, 2.5% growth rate, and they just don't have enough food to feed all of their people. These definitions that we talk about are based on nutritional requirements. You know, the old well-balanced diet thing that you hear about. There are plenty of Americans that are malnourished. There is a problem in America with chronic hunger, undernutrition. We've already told you what that definition is. Malnourished means that your diet lacks the correct balance. You're not getting enough protein in your diet, carbohydrates, vitamins. All of those things point to being malnourished. Now, food security is a term that we use to describe conditions in which people have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious foods in order to meet their dietary needs. So most countries seek this, especially the LEDCs. The poor countries very much seek food security. That is, all of their people have access to all of the food that they need. A famine is a condition in which thousands of people die as a result of lack of food. You might call famine the result of food insecurity. And this happens around the world where there are lots and lots of people, but not enough food to go around. You've probably heard the medical term anemia before. Anemia is, especially when we talk about iron deficiency, is a lack of red blood cells or a lack of iron to make your red blood cells operate the way they need to operate. But anemia is the underlying medical condition that ends up causing other diseases such as malaria, AIDS, parasite infestations. All of these things can take hold much easier and much better if the person that contracts these diseases has anemia. Remember that we're talking about really iron in the diet here. And of course, then we have this term called overnutrition. We probably have this problem here in our country. But the World Health Organization estimates that there are about 1 billion people in the world who are overweight. 300 million are considered obese. Obesity means you're 20% higher than your ideal weight. Overnutrition can cause several different diseases as well. For instance, diabetes, type 2 diabetes in particular, hypertension, heart disease, stroke. These are all diseases that are commonly manifested in the fact that people are eating way too many calories for what their requirements are. Meat consumption is a big deal around the world. You can see here, we certainly do a lot better when it comes to annual meat consumption than all of the other places on earth. This is the global averages since 1960. And you can see we consume an awful lot of meat. In general, higher meat consumption can be attributed to better incomes, having more money. Meat is generally a more expensive foodstuff than the other grains that most people live on. Corn, rice, wheat, rye, those types of things. So globally, not nearly the amount of meat available for these people to eat per capita, this is per person, as compared to the United States, going back to about the year 2000. There's about 50,000 edible plant species, but we rely principally on those three I just mentioned: corn, rice, and wheat. Truly, those are the three grains that feed the world. Not so much meat. Of course, we do here in the United States. This graphic here is in your book. I believe, yeah, it's on page 286. And you can see the total grain production and then per capita grain. And you can see that the total grain production continues to rise over time, which is what we'd expect. We need to grow more and more grain to feed all the more mouths that are on this planet. But here's the problem. Notice that per capita grain production hasn't risen very much over time. That's because there's so many more people. This is a concern to environmentalists. People who analyze this data recognize this trend, that the per person amount of grain grown hasn't really risen much at all over time. So what are the reasons for undernutrition and malnutrition? Well, the first one is obvious: poverty. If you don't have enough money, you can't eat properly. So around the world, all those people that live in huts, are barefoot, make $10 a month or $100 a month even, those people live in poverty, and so they're in many cases either undernourished or malnourished. The second important factor is political and economic forces. For example, refugee populations. These are people that have fled their home due to a war or a natural disaster, and they end up living in tents. They're displaced from their homes, and they go to places where there's not enough food for them. Also, political factors are involved here. In a lot of these developing countries, we have third world dictators, so to speak, and even if there is enough food for their people, these leaders will hoard the food, or they will control the movement of food to try to control their populations. And then the third reason for malnutrition or undernutrition is a key fact, because the more and more livestock on this planet, the more cows there are than ever before, because there's more people eating meat than ever before, and chickens, these animals have to be fed. So more and more of the foods that we grow, our crops, agricultural resources, are diverted to feed livestock and poultry rather than to feed the people. Let's move on to the next section here. The Green Revolution. So-called Green Revolution. When you hear that term, you think, wow, isn't that an environmentally friendly thing? Well, we call it the Green Revolution because it ushered in the age of what we call industrial farming. And what's happening here is, instead of having people out in the fields cultivating the crops, we have increasingly required machines. Reliance on those machines means lots of more energy being used to bring that food to your table. And that's what we're talking about here. The energy subsidy, the amount of energy it takes to get you a calorie of energy in your diet. And you can see what some of those statistics are. Pretty amazing, actually. If you were just a hunter and gatherer, like back in caveman times, you didn't use very much energy to feed yourself. Maybe the only energy you used was your own effort. But as time goes on, we see a small-scale growing of crops as we hit the agricultural period. And we go on and on up the scale here to see how much energy it takes to feed us. Even to grow the chickens for large-scale egg production, you can see uses a lot of energy. And what is this energy that's being used? Most of it is fossil fuels. Most of it's gasoline to operate the machines to get the food to your house. It might be the truck that delivers the pound of ground meat at Publix. We're certainly talking about the slaughterhouses. They use a tremendous amount of gasoline-powered machines to slaughter the cattle. Talking about the trucks that have to carry the cattle, you get the idea. And in addition to that, we have the tremendous efforts that have to be used, the amount of fuel that has to be used by boats so that we can have the fish that we use. And that's one of the reasons why you'll always hear people talk about buying local produce and buying local meats, buying local fish, because that severely decreases the amount of energy required to deliver that piece of fish to you so that you can eat it in your diet. So the Green Revolution is kind of a misnomer. It's named because it was a revolution in how we produce food, but most of it's pretty bad. And the reason it's pretty bad is because of all the environmental damage that's done by increasing our yield per acre. Now, nobody's saying we shouldn't be doing a better job of producing more yield for our acreage, but we have to recognize the amount of damage done to the environment when we use these green techniques. So what are some of these things? Mechanization, of course, is huge. You've all seen pictures of these great big giant combines, big tractors and things that are used to harvest our crops. Fertilizers are another big thing. Fertilizers are chemicals, we'll talk more about them a little bit later, that contain important nutrients for plants. And in order to supplement what's available in the soil, we go ahead and add fertilizers, and that can cause its own environmental damage. We've spoken, for instance, about the nitrogen and phosphorus containing chemicals that end up running off into our local ponds and lakes, causing eutrophication. Irrigation becomes a real issue for these large-scale farms, corporate farms, industrial farms, in which they spend a tremendous amount of money buying machinery to get water to their crops. In addition, we have a tremendous effort to improve the crop varieties. You know, I used to always say when I taught biology, farmers are really the geneticists of today, because for 100 years, farmers have realized how to cross the best traits in different crops to get the absolute best yield that they can. So we've definitely improved on what types of genetically modified plants we use to maximize yield. And then one of the things that you hear about all the time here in the United States is farmers decrying something called agribusiness. Huge conglomerate companies that come in, they're only interested in their bottom line. So they do more and more growing of crops, and they do it all in the interest of profit. And the small family farmer, there's not a lot of them left. In fact, most family farms exist only because of subsidies that our government provides to them. Irrigation has its own other problems, and I think I've got some slides here to discuss how these different activities have particular environmental concerns. All right, let's talk about each of those issues and then we'll end this video. First of all, mechanization. The huge economies of scale that have been achieved with great big tractors and trucks and all those things that have really improved the ability for us to bring crops to market. But that mechanization comes with a cost. In the rich countries and the MEDCs, only about 5% of the workforce is used to create all of the food that we eat. In LEDCs, you can see they don't have mechanization. They can't afford those great big combines and those great big tractors. So 40 to 70% of the workforce is dedicated to producing food in the LEDCs. That's a big deal. When it comes to irrigation, here are the two big issues. You need to memorize these and be familiar with them. If you ever are asked a question about why is irrigation a problem when it comes to farming, here they are. The first one is waterlogging, and waterlogging is basically the fact that too much water gets down to where the plant root systems are. Plants that have too much water in their root system are impaired. They cannot get enough oxygen and they don't grow properly. The other big issue, and it's shown here in this picture that's in the book, is salinization. Now, you've all seen salinization. You've seen salinity before. That's the amount of salt. And when we use irrigation practices to artificially provide water to crops, there is trace amounts of salt in that water. And over time, putting all of that water on all of those crops and letting it sit on the surface of the ground, and then evaporation happens. So the water sits on the ground, water evaporates, and the salt gets left behind. When that salt gets left behind, all in the soil, it has way too much NaCl to be healthy for plants, and we have something called salinization. Remember those two terms. They're big in the environmental community. And of course, here's a nice picture of the type of irrigation systems that we use. We've already talked about the much preferred irrigation system in farming. It's called drip irrigation. When it comes to fertilizers, we have organic, or sometimes you'll think of it as natural fertilizers. Organic fertilizers, of course, are the use of animal droppings, things that are rich in humus. But increasingly, we will use inorganic fertilizers. This is just made in a chemical plant. Nitrogen, phosphorus. Think nitrogen. I think nitrogen is the most important one for you to remember. And of course, as I was talking to you about nitrogen, these fertilizer compounds do not end up inside of the plant. We spray them on top of the plant and hope that the fertilizer reaches the ground and seeps into the soil and the plants can use them. What happens most of the time, in fact, I've seen statistics that tell us about 10% of the fertilizer that gets sprayed actually ends up in the plant. All of the rest of that fertilizer ends up running off and getting into our water supply, causing such problems as eutrophication. Monocropping is the fourth big problem when it came to the Green Revolution. Monocropping, you can tell from the name, means planting one crop and only one crop. And we've become very good at that. Look at this wheat field. Miles and miles, as far as the eye can see, of wheat being grown. Monocropping is the dominant practice of agriculture in our country. It gives us the advantage of improved productivity and efficiency, but at a cost. When you grow one crop and only one crop, you leave your crop vulnerable to pests, and of course, all of this mechanization in monocropping brings us to increased soil erosion. There is a fifth one called pesticides, and I think I'd like to start that with the next video. So I'm going to cut it off here. And thank you for paying attention and listening. Aren't you glad you didn't have to see me this time? Talk to you later. Bye-bye.